understand that prior to 1800s and whatnot, prior to 1700s for sure, these groups are sovereign, they're autonomous, they're allowed to kind of operate however they want. And after 1867, through the Indian Act, through the formation of the Canadian government, the vast majority of what they do on a day-to-day basis is controlled by a different group, and by a group that may not have their best interests in mind, right? And so that's going to produce a lot of conflicts and a lot of issues there. Okay, keep in mind this PowerPoint is available for you to peruse through later on as well. Okay, you're probably going to need to review this before our next chapter test, which, quite frankly, I'll just let you kids know right now, isn't going to be that far away from now. Okay. So around the 1960s and 70s is likely when this when things started to change for Indigenous people. So in 1961, if they got a university degree, they didn't lose their status. So now that means that they can actually participate in higher education. But by 1960s, as you can imagine, if the residential schools have been going on since 1880s, by 1960, many Indigenous groups likely didn't have a good relationship with any sort of let's call them government structures. They probably didn't have a good relationship with the education system, so they likely probably wouldn't even want to go to university at that point, right? If their experience in school from the age of like 6 to 16 was so terrible for not only them, for their children, maybe their parents, someone they knew, they might have a hesitancy to even go to university to get a degree. So as I was mentioning before, Pierre Elliott Trudeau wanted to eliminate the Indian Act and replace it with the white paper, but there's a number of Indigenous people, they kind of responded with the red paper, kind of the reasons why the Indian Act should remain, from what I recall when I learned about it, or just specifying why Indigenous people should have specific rights within Canada. They shouldn't just be treated as any standard Canadian. So there's lots of complications there. Okay, in the 1970s, they started addressing some of the sexism that occurred in the Indian Act. So again, keep in mind, if you're a status woman, if you're an Indigenous woman and you decided to marry someone who wasn't Indigenous, you lost your status. Which, the point I raised earlier doesn't make sense, considering, if you always know one parent for sure. You don't know the other parent. Okay. 1978, Sandra Lovelace challenged the loss of status through marrying out. She petitioned the UN Human Rights Committee in her request. In 1981, the committee ruled that the loss of status upon marrying a non-status man violated the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So by the 1970s and 80s, the United Nations exists. I think 1951 is when the United Nations has its own Declaration of Human Rights that is a suggestion for the world to follow through. And so, people can start raising their concerns to the United Nations, which is an international organization. Okay, 1973, the Canadian Supreme Court rules that Indigenous land rights do exist based on the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which then means that many other groups can start gaining rights and access to their own land and the right to, hunt, fish, and partake in traditional activities. So 100,000 people gained status in 1985 when that marrying out rule that we just previously mentioned is overturned. Give me a second, how many more slides are there? We got like 2 more slides. In 2007, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was adopted by the General Assembly with 144 votes in favor and 4 votes against it. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States voted against its passing. That's actually very funny, yeah.
Those are all the countries that have indigenous peoples.
Well, there's indigenous people in many places, but these 4 countries in particular have like a very violent and horrible history with their indigenous groups. It's not surprising at all that the 4 of them said no to giving indigenous people various rights. Okay, there's a document that I shared on your Google Classroom that kind of looks at what the what the UNDRIP is, we can call it. Okay. I think we'll just pass over this. Okay, I'm gonna stop the recording.